There's a lot of debate around the concept of equity and how much race and ethnicity impact opportunity for the next generation. But what if there's a better way to equip kids to lead successful and happy lives?
These are levers within your control. Decisions you make around your family, decisions you make around your education, decision you make around your work. Those are all things within your control. So don't feel solely because of your race you're trapped in a certain outcome for your life.
On this episode, we're going to equip you with a principled alternative to the victimhood narrative that is actually more effective in helping young people of all races lead successful lives, and it's more aligned with America's founding ideals. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and the issue we're talking about has been one that's been on the top of mind for public dialogue here in this country for a number of years. Since 2020, public debate about opportunity for the next generation has largely centered on race, with the common narrative being that an individual's race is one of the most important factors impacting their likelihood of leading a successful life. This has led to debates over things like DEI, CRT, and how they impact public policy, especially in the realm of education. But our guest this week offers a different and I think a better vision to orient us towards what's actually impactful for the next generation. His name is Ian Rowe, and he's the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. He's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the author of Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. And also, most importantly, he's a husband and a father. Ian Rowe, thank you so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you very much. My wife would be very happy that you added those last two identifiers, those two titles of husband and father. You know, sometimes we forget that those are the ones that are far more important than many of the technical titles that we often promote.
I think you're right, and I think it's especially relevant to this conversation because we're talking about the next generation and what is a better elevated vision to help them have the kind of opportunities they need in their lives. So with that, I want to frame the conversation as you heard in the intro. There have been so many conversations around race and ethnicity in this country, and your book, Agency, which we'll include in the show notes, I encourage everyone to read. Go out and buy it and read it, because it is really impactful, especially in this moment in our country. These ideas would be meaningful anytime, but especially right now, we're having kind of this big national fight over what's best for the next generation. And I want to ask you first, with this notion of equity that comes up so often in our dialogues now publicly, you have often spoken critically of the term equity as sort of a driving principle animating our public debate. For example, you wrote in a recent piece in the National Review, where you say, quote, "Across a country now transfixed by the pursuit of equity, there is an obsession with determining what factors drive economic inequality and whether a person is inherently privileged or inherently oppressed based on a single characteristic, most notably race." Why is that, and why do you think that maybe an equity-based approach to public policy is maybe not the best way to go?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. You know, I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School from the class of 1993. And when I was at business school, the term equity was one that was incredibly exciting, because at the time, the internet was starting to boom. There were all these business opportunities. And so equity had a meaning that was connected to unlimited opportunity, that you could have equity in an enterprise with unlimited potential, that if you worked hard, having equity in a rising endeavor could be one of great return and great reward. What has shifted over the last several decades is equity now, rather than being a symbol of unlimited enterprise, is more now almost a zero-sum game, in which equity means not equal opportunity for an individual that has unlimited enterprise. Instead, it's equality of outcome at an identity group level, right? So as opposed to Ian Rowe having the ability to fulfill all of my God-given potential, no, Ian Rowe as a Black person has to be part of a group which is either oppressed or unoppressed, where the only way to achieve equity is that the same exact outcomes for a group of Black people have to equal the same outcomes as a group of white people. And so, for example, proponents of equity, their evidence that equity does not exist is when they see disparities at the group identity level. And Ibram Kendi, for example, the author of a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is famous for saying, when I see racial disparities, I see racism, period, end of story. And the only way to address the inequity in his eyes and those of the people that believe in these equity-based solutions is to force equal outcomes by group. And it's fundamentally un-American. In many ways, it's more like a Marxist or more communist kind of ideology.
Are there some good examples of that in practice? As you mentioned, this idea that's either been misapplied or perverted or just used in a way that is not helpful and not grounded, as you say, in kind of these core American principles. You've spoken before, and we've seen some news out of places like Oregon or California or Illinois, where this idea of equity has been affecting proficiency standards in education. What are, in your mind, some of the best examples that are compelling to demonstrate, hey, this kind of approach of equity is actually not good for our kids?
Well, if your single vision, if you look at the world not at the equality of opportunity by individual perspective, and instead you're always looking at group performance and differences in group performance, then you will tend to think, for example, if you see differences by race, then you'll tend to believe that those differences by race are due to discrimination by race. And as a result, all of your solutions are then race-based. So let's take, for example, reading in our country. It is absolutely true that for decades, if you look at reading performance amongst Black students versus white students, you will see that there's been a pretty consistent reading gap in that the percentage of white students reading at grade level proficiency is usually meaningfully higher than reading proficiency amongst Black students. And that's true at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. But for those people who say, see, there it is, that's the proof of racial discrimination, the set of solutions they come up with is, well, in order to equalize this, let's remove some of the assessments that are revealing these differences. So for example, in Oregon, as you just mentioned, an entire state said, you know what, in order to address these inequities, to make it, to help our quote unquote marginalized students, our kids of color, let's make it so that we no longer require these students to have to demonstrate proficiency in reading in order to graduate from high school. And even on the national level, if you were to equalize performance between Black and white students, all you'd actually be achieving is universal mediocrity, because there has never been a year in which a majority of white students in our country are reading at grade level. And so the point being, perhaps there are factors not related to race that are far more explanatory as to why kids of all races are not reading at proficiency. This is just one of many, many examples where this equity-based lens can actually develop solutions that you're lowering standards for everyone. One final example, in New Jersey, a few months ago, the New Jersey State Board of Education was unhappy with the percentage of kids that were demonstrating proficiency to graduate from high school. And so what did they decide to do? Because they wanted to have more Black and brown kids be able to show their readiness to graduate from high school. They changed what's called the cut score. The cut score being the level at which you'd have to perform on an exam to be, to demonstrate that you're ready to be promoted. Well, under the old cut score, only 36% of all kids in New Jersey were demonstrating proficiency ready for high school. Under the new cut score, 80% of kids are now demonstrating proficiency. So just voila, just like that, you have changed the game, but all you've really done is taken a cynical approach and created a cosmetic solution without addressing the true underlying reason why kids of all races are not reading at the levels that we know that they can achieve.
And we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about if there's a better variable we should be looking at with respect to these outcomes for kids. You've written about it extensively in your book and your other writings, and it's really kind of an opportunity, I think, to shift the lens towards something that if we all care about what's best for the next generation, helping them to be successful and lead fulfilling lives, which I think we do, there's a better approach, which you've outlined in your book, Agency. So I want to get into that after the break and dive into some of the things that you have found in your work and maybe some of the things you'd recommend for the rest of us. So we're going to take a quick break. This is Defending Ideas. We're talking with Ian Rowe. We'll be right back. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at AEI, the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, and the author of Agency, also a husband and father, which is especially relevant to this conversation because we're talking about the next generation and how best to equip young people with the knowledge and skills they need to lead successful, happy lives. Before we jump back into the conversation, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can get access to short clips from this episode, as well as previous episodes that you can use on social media and in your conversations about these issues with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms like Google, Spotify, Apple, wherever you like to get your shows. Just go to your favorite platform, type in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and click that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Ian, You mentioned just a minute ago this idea that sort of the equity approach, it's flawed for a number of reasons, but also because it's maybe focusing on the wrong thing. And I want to ask you if we as a society, especially in the last few years, have kind of been fixated on the wrong variable. And I want to read a quote from another piece you wrote that was a review of the book, The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Carney, to frame this and then get your reaction to it. You say in this piece, marriage and stable two-parent families matter monumentally to the life prospects of children, far more than the usually invoked suspects of race and gender. You go on to say, with such huge differences in family structure by race, how can one not fairly conclude that family structure disparity is the greatest driving force behind racial disparities in education, crime, and virtually every area of concern for kids growing into young adulthood? Ian, with that kind of framing, I guess help to sell our listeners. If they're like, I'm a little skeptical, I've been hearing for years this racial equity issue, convince them that, well, actually family probably matters more.
Yeah. So it's a really great question. And I'm glad you asked that, because we should start with the premise that people who perhaps have been arguing for equity have the same intentions that we do, which is to help understand what are the factors that are most prevalent in driving human flourishing. So I think it's good for us to not demonize one another and really defend ideas. So this is how I defend this idea. Because it is often the case that people who are arguing for equity and saying that race matters most, they use data, for example, the racial wealth gap. If one were to look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, you would see that the median wealth of the average white family is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average Black family. That is a fact that is indisputable. When you look at race alone as the only factor, there is a very large disparity. And for those people who believe in historical and present day racial oppression of the United States, that is the proof for them, and which is why they argue for equity-based solutions, which is, well, then let's have reparations where every Black person in this country should get $160,000 as compensation. The problem is, or the opportunity, is that you can also look at the same exact 2019 survey of consumer finances and take into account just two additional factors: family structure and education. When you take into account just those two factors, the median wealth of the average married, college-educated Black family is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average white single-parent family. Now, why is that important for people to know? Well, perhaps in the same way we talked about with educational outcomes, perhaps race is not the only factor as relates to wealth. And in fact, factors like marriage, family structure, education level are far more determinative. So I would want the people who are constantly saying race is the dividing factor in our country to actually take a step back and look at that data. It is still the case that in the Black community, the poverty rate for married Black families has been in the single digits for as long as the data has been collected. So what does that mean when we're trying to look for overall solutions? So those are the kinds of data points I would encourage proponents of race-based equity as the solution for every problem, is to say that there's compelling data that is far more powerful. And frankly, as someone who runs schools, I can say to my students, who are primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students, that these are levers within your control. Decisions you make around your family, decisions you make around your education, decision you make around your work, those are all things within your control. So don't feel solely because of your race, you're trapped in a certain outcome for your life.
Ian, I think that's a great segue to the title of your book, and this, what I view as sort of an elevated message that honestly I think should replace the concept of equity. And you have spoken on this many times very convincingly and eloquently, that you use this term agency, that we don't need equity, we need agency. Can you walk us through kind of how you arrived at that, what that is, and why it is a more powerful word with a vision and a framework associated with it than equity to help the next generation?
Yeah. So, I run schools in the heart of some of the poorest communities in the Bronx. I've run schools in the South Bronx, Lower East Side of Manhattan for the last 15 years. And so I've worked with a lot of different kinds of kids. And I've noticed and really observed over certainly decades, but accelerated since 2020, most perhaps because of the death of George Floyd, is that these emerging narratives have occurred which basically say what a young person cannot do in our society, especially based on race. And that there are these two narratives, what I call blame the system, and the other I call blame the victim. In a blame the system narrative, that's a view of America that if you're not successful, it's because America itself is an inherently oppressive nation. That based on your race, your class, your gender, the systems are rigged against you. Capitalism is evil. racism is everywhere. There's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. And these forces are so powerful that you as an individual are powerless to overcome. And that is very much kind of an equity-based approach where these systems are holding down whole groups of people defined by a certain identity. And now, obviously, that's a very demeaning and disempowering message. Simultaneously, there's also this other message of blame the victim. In that narrative, that's a view of America that if you're not successful in this country, the land of opportunity, then you must be the problem. You didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You didn't take advantage of all these opportunities. And so, but the problem with that narrative is that if you're 12 years old and you're in a district like where we've just opened up our new virtues-based high school, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college in this community. And there's a cap on the ability for folks to open new great charter schools, right? So a 12-year-old can't solve that problem. So between the blame the system and the blame the victim narrative, basically a young person's told either the system is rigged against you or it's your fault for not being able to master it. And I think that's inherently debilitating. And in my experience, there is an empowering alternative. This idea of what I call agency, the ability to lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. In many ways, I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So this idea that everyone has free will, but the question is, how do you exercise it? In what direction? What shapes your decisions? And so if you think of agency like a vector or velocity, velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So the question is, for those of us, all of us who have free will, there are lots of people that have free will that have exercised it in a pretty horrific way. So what gives a young person guidance? And that's where I've created my framework, FREE: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, as 4 pillars that I'm happy to go into. But if more young people were to embrace those 4 pillars and the promise held within each one, I believe we'd have more young people capable of exercising the kind of agency that would lead them to a life of human flourishing.
And I think one of the things that's powerful about everything you're saying and everything you've written about is, so in recent years when these debates about equity were kind of really at their height, and seeing these things happen in corporate boardrooms and government entities and the media and so on and so forth, I remember feeling a little bit frustrated, not that we don't want to root out racial discrimination, because we all do and we agree with that, but again, as some of the examples you've articulated, the form that it took that seemed to be, again, not helping young people and not being based on the right variable. I remember thinking all of this work around, the kind of the equity focus, if you were to go and, into West Valley, one of the large cities near where we are in Salt Lake City, Utah, and drive to, in fact, when you were out here for our event in March, we did this. We were driving around in West Valley City and through the 84119 zip code, which has the highest concentration in Salt Lake County of families in intergenerational poverty. I never saw the connection between how kind of this equity mindset at the high level in our public dialogue would help a young Hispanic kid coming from a single mother household, just to make up an example, in a deep poverty area of West Valley City, rise up and live a better life. But everything you're describing, it would do that. And the data seems to show that. We've talked a lot recently about the success sequence, and that the education, work, and marriage before kids, that's something you talk about in your book as well. So can you expand on a little bit before we go to our next break, why these sort of pillars, these institutional pillars, these ideas are typically so impactful for the next generation to, again, help shift our lens onto these things as a better approach for the next generation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the people who advocate for these equity-based solutions, they're typically top-down answers. They're trying to achieve equal outcomes at the group level. And it is possible to, for example, like New York State just made a decision that they're likely going to eliminate what are called Regents exams, which are the vehicles by which a young person, again, demonstrates that they've earned the right to graduate from high school. But because the New York State leadership is unhappy with the racial disparities of what these tests reveal, let's just eliminate the tests. Let's just lower the standard and create other very subjective measures that help no one. We do our kids no service. We do them no favors when we end up lowering standards in the name of equity, especially when we're trying to do things at the identity group level. The reason that I think the F.R.E.E. framework is so powerful is that it operates at the individual level. Agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. And so that's why these institutions of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship are so important, because the message is you can have agency in your life. You don't have to do it alone. And again, we can talk about how a young person would interact with each of these pillars. But the point is, all of these pillars are within your grasp. How you form your family, whether or not you have a personal faith commitment, how you do an education, whether or not you have an entrepreneurial spirit. Those are all things within your control, not these top-down equity-based solutions that ask you for nothing and instead typically demand massive government redistribution initiatives that are based on this false premise that the way to create human flourishing is to ensure that every group outcome is equal, even if all that means is equal misery and equal mediocrity.
I think the individuality of what you're saying is very powerful as well, because it does go to the person and say, you have potential. This set of ideas, this set of institutions is going to help you achieve that potential. And when we come back from the break, I want to get into maybe talk a little bit more about kind of those specific pillars in F.R.E.E. of family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, how the success sequence is sort of part of the undergirding foundation for that, and then maybe leave our listeners with a couple of things that policymakers ought to be thinking about. We're having these conversations in Utah and elsewhere, and kind of finish off the discussion that way with a what's next? How do we translate this into some real policy initiatives that can make a difference for this generation? So we'll get into that right after the break. We're talking with Ian Rowe here on Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Ian Rowe from Vertex Partnership Academies in New York, and also Senior Fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a husband and father, and the author of Agency, a book that we've been talking about. We'll link to all of this in the show notes. There are very incredibly powerful ideas in Ian's body of work and experience that can provide a better alternative vision to how we lift up the next generation and create a society that's truly based on opportunity for everyone. So we're going to continue the conversation and answer some questions about what are some policy implications of these ideas. But I want to mention briefly, if you are enjoying this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast there on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and hit that subscribe button. You can also find short clips from this conversation that you can share on social media to help to defend these ideas in your conversations with friends and family and neighbors. That's defendingideas.org. Ian, as we round out this conversation, I think that the message you provide, it's really a vision a very American vision grounded in this idea of that every individual has inherent dignity and potential. And how can we arrange our society, yes, our policies, but also our institutions and our cultural institutions to help them achieve that potential? And so I want to mention that one of the things I love about your work is that you're not just an expert who works at a think tank, though you are at AEI, but you're also a practitioner. So you have the benefit of studying this and looking at the data, looking at the evidence, but then also seeing how things work on the ground in real life for the exact folks that we're trying to help lead successful, meaningful lives. So what have you learned from that experience? And again, kind of flesh out a little bit this F.R.E.E. framework that in the data and in your experience shows that this is actually a really compelling vision.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And it is true, many of my colleagues in the think tank world, they produce policy papers and research, and it's extremely important. But I often find that there is a disconnect between kind of the theoretical academia world and what's happening on 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx. And so I do try to bridge those worlds. And I've been very fortunate over my entire career, starting from my early days at Teach for America, volunteering in schools throughout New York City, working in different capacities in the White House and other places where I had to really interact with virtually every kind of kid, and certainly running schools in the South Bronx for the last 15 years. I've worked with rich kids, poor kids, white kids, Black kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, foster care, kids in homeless shelters. And, I've seen kids growing up in domestic violence, poverty. And as I observed those young people as they made decisions, as they entered young adulthood, what I've observed is that some of those young people growing up in some of the toughest conditions, as they made decisions, unfortunately recreated those same challenging conditions of disadvantage, almost perpetuating the cycle of poverty, the cycle of deprivation. But in my experience, I've also seen kids in those same exact conditions, same exact single parenthood, domestic violence, abuse, neglect, maltreatment. As they became young adults, they made different sets of decisions that put them on a completely different pathway, decisions that empowered them to break the cycle of disadvantage. And the animating question of my life is, what makes the difference? What is it that led that latter group of young people to create a far different reality for themselves, a life of possibility? And my observation over the last 30 years is that those young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage usually had a sense of personal agency. They had a belief that they could lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. But it didn't come from nowhere. It didn't just that they were just the fortunate few. In my observation, there were 4 important institutions that helped them cultivate that sense of personal agency. And that's how I came to this framework of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. The first observation is that the young people that were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, regardless of the family that they were from, they were on the pathway to form a strong family. And that pathway usually meant that they were following, and you mentioned it earlier, the success sequence, which is data that says if a young person finishes just a high school degree and then gets a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if they have children, marriage first, 97% of millennials who follow that decisions in terms of family formation avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. So that's information that we teach in our schools. We teach the success sequence data. So that's the first F in F.R.E.E., that young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage are on the pathway to form a strong family. The second observation for these young people is that they had a personal faith commitment. They lived by a moral code, usually informed by some type of organized religion, whether it's Christianity, Judaism. There were a set of tenets. They were part of a community of people that practiced these morals in action, in real life. And so there was an expectation that these young people, when they faced inevitable challenges, had a moral framework to fall back on. My third observation was that these young people able to break the cycle of advantage usually benefited from some kind of educational freedom or school choice. You know, in this district where we are in the Bronx, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. And there's a cap. There's a legislative barrier on opening new schools. How do we expect kids to come up the rung of life to human flourishing if they can't even get access to a great education? And so this idea that if a young person is on the pathway to form a strong family, had a personal faith commitment, benefited from educational freedom, those three usually led to create the conditions that a young person has what I call the entrepreneurial spirit. They're a problem solver in their own lives. So when challenges inevitably came, they didn't just fold and fall down. They were creative, they were innovative, and devised strategies to overcome those issues. So that's my message. Family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Those are the pillars that if young people embrace them, they could lead the kinds of lives of human flourishing. That's what I've observed by young people being raised in very tough situations, and yet they were able to break out.
Ian, something striking in what you've spoken about when you have worked to implement this in your schools is kind of a knowledge gap. That, as you mentioned, the success sequence being one of the key sort of foundational components of your F.R.E.E. framework, that students or young people weren't really hearing about the success sequence. That they, I imagine there's kind of a, wow, you mean I can make these decisions and it has that big of an impact on whether or not I experience poverty? Can you share some of your experiences when you were initially essentially saying, hey, we need to be sharing this with young people? What was it like at first? What was some of the pushback you faced, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, so when we first started conceiving this idea, wow, this is powerful information. I mean, what other set of strategies have the outcomes that 97% of the people who follow this set of strategies avoid poverty? There's no policy prescription that I'm aware of. And yet these are factors that are within the controls of our students. So we decided to teach it. To my surprise, there was a lot of pushback. Some grown-ups who said, you can't teach this. Many of these kids, their parents didn't follow the success sequence in their own lives. So you might be shaming them. You might be embarrassing them. You just shouldn't teach it at all. And it really threw us for a loop. I mean, we're trying to show kids in communities where the non-marital birth rate is more than 80%, so the norms that they're seeing aren't reflective of the possibility that's inherent within the success sequence. So we decided to teach it, and over time, it's gained more support. What's interesting is that when we were first devising this strategy, I was visiting high schools across the country. And I remember visiting a high school in New Orleans in a very heavily low-income community. And I said, and this was around the time we were getting a lot of pushback for teaching the success sequence in schools in New York City. I said to this group of ninth grade students, almost all low-income, Black, Asian, and Hispanic students, I said to these ninth graders, if you knew that there were a series of decisions in your control, that when young people just like you followed those decisions, 97% avoided poverty. Would you want to know what those decisions are? And of course, these young people with their inquisitive minds said, well, yeah, of course why wouldn't we want to know that? And then I said, well, there's some grown-ups who think that I should not tell you, that somehow I would be embarrassing you or shaming you, and so better I don't tell you at all. And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what are you talking about? You tell us, don't tease us with this information. You tell us, and then we'll decide whether or not we think it's important information as we decide the big decisions in our own lives. And we then proceeded to have this wonderful conversation about this thing called the success sequence. And what's important is that the way in which we discussed it is that I wasn't prescriptive, I was descriptive, meaning saying to them, look, at the end of the day, you're the architect of your own life. You will get to make these decisions. And so we want to ensure that you know that there's one pathway of decisions that results in this economic likelihood of prosperity. Here's another set of decisions, maybe in different order, that results in a much lower probability of avoiding poverty. And here's yet another set of decisions. But the point is, you decide. You're the constructor of your own life. And at the end of the conversation, what was so interesting is that I felt that these students felt for the first time that they were being treated, they were being respected as future decision makers within their own lives. And that, I just feel, that's what we're trying to do. That's how we're trying to cultivate a sense of agency, a sense of how you can lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose.
Ian, as we wrap up, it seems like a couple of clear, next steps for people who hear this and say, this is a powerful vision. I want to start to move this forward. We've talked, as we've been talking a number of times, about the success sequence and how there could be some opportunities to teach that to students, as you were doing. Another one we talked about is this idea of family structure being a really important variable that sometimes is left off the table. Do you think that just something as simple as, and it would sound like a little bit of a wonky kind of data thing, but just incorporating family structure data in as much public-facing data reporting as we can, so when things come out with outcomes for kids and it talks about, well, outcomes broken out by race, ethnicity, gender, geography, income, we're not saying get rid of other variables that are informative and instructive, but add on family structure, married two-parent households versus other arrangements. Is that sort of a simple but very impactful step to help to orient our public conversations towards more of these formative institutions?
Yes, I very much think so. As someone who runs schools and education, each year when new reading or math proficiency rates are released, you will see a lot of student achievement information disaggregated by race, by class, by gender, by geography, by even the English language learner status of the student. But you will almost never see the information disaggregated by family structure, whether or not that child is being raised in a married two-parent household or a single-parent household, or they're being raised by their grandparents. And the reason that's important is that those factors, family structure, typically transcend the relevance of these other factors, what I call the usual suspects. So to your point, it's not that we have to stop reporting on race and class and gender. Those can at times be important, but we obscure what is arguably the most important factor, which is what is the family structure that you are being raised in. And the reason that's important is that as we think about interventions, not just for this generation, but for the next generation, if we see based on the data that the most important factor driving academic or other outcomes for our kids is family structure, and in particular, married two-parent households, then our prescriptions are to how to create more married two-parent households for the rising generation. And so it is a piece of data, family structure data, which if I could wave a magic wand, that almost would be one of the single greatest changes that I would make.
Ian, we're about at time. I want to ask as we close up, speaking of waving magic wands, so family structure data, incorporating that absolutely makes sense as an impactful step to help to orient our policymaker conversations towards just how impactful this institution is for kids' outcomes. Thinking in a broader sense, especially with everything that you've said over the course of this episode and kind of your body of work, if you could wave an even bigger magic wand and look back over the last few years, and if you could essentially take all of or even most of the national time, energy, resources, and focus that's been spent on equity and things of that nature and redirect it to focus on the importance of the family, the importance of family structure, and these formative civic institutions that you have found uplift students, would you make that trade?
Oh, I would absolutely make the trade. I mean, what have been the results of the equity focus over the last few years? Reading proficiency rates are certainly not higher. Crime rates are certainly not lower. In fact, in many communities across the country where you had initiatives like defunding the police, crime has skyrocketed in the very populations that were being served. Companies that virtue signaled in the name of equity, standards that have been lowered. So I would trade all of it because we've seen none of the positive outcomes that were promised by moving in the direction of trying to create equal outcomes by identity group. So I'd take all of it and repurpose that into an ideology that recognizes the inherent dignity of each individual. And we identify and strengthen the core institutions of strengthening families, strengthening faith-based organizations, providing more educational choice and freedom in schools. All of those are the kinds of institutional investments that ultimately accrue to helping more young people be able to embrace and execute against the personal agency that already exists within them if we have the courage to bring it out.
Ian, we're at time. I'd love to talk for hours with you about this stuff because it's so powerful. And I love that it's optimistic and hopeful, which we need more of in our time. It's easy to look at headlines or social media and be so frustrated about the way we discuss issues in this country. But I think you have modeled so well this hopeful, optimistic message. Not only is it optimistic, but it's empowering and it's effective. It's a better way to help lift people up to live a better life. So thank you so much for all of your body of work and for spending some time with us today on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nic.
Well, we have one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. We're so grateful to Ian Rowe for sharing his time with us today. We'll finish up our episode after this. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. To finish up, how do we take what Ian just said in our conversation and use it in our conversations with people who might have a different view? Try these 3 talking points. Number 1, it's a fundamental American principle that each person has inherent dignity and potential, and our policies, our education systems, and our institutions should strive to empower every child in our country, regardless of race, to realize that potential. This is a moral principle that should be broadly popular. Number 2, I think folks who are largely focusing on racial equity are mostly motivated by a deep sense of fairness, driving them to want to help others who happen to be part of a demographic that has faced discrimination. That desire for fairness and opportunity for all is noble. However, as Ian articulated, this approach is flawed in practice because it usually doesn't show much actual improvement, and flawed in principle because it focuses too much on group identity and outcomes most of the time, while missing more impactful drivers like family, education, and other things. Number 3, we should acknowledge that these first 2 points, the dignity and potential of all people and the just desire for fairness and opportunity, when combined together, actually point us to agency as an animating principle for how we empower the next generation. And that is an idea I think is worth defending. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, please share it with your friends and family on social media. You can find full episode links and short clips that you can share by going to defendingideas.org, or you can also access our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe there by just searching for Defending Ideas in the search bar. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's all for this episode. Thanks so much for listening to Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. See you next time.